the great conservative movement of America and of our time. A brush fire of freedom is being lit all over this country. We, as an irate, tireless American populace, will overcome a few radical leftists that control the levers of power today. Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe, and the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of my semi-regular podcast called What's the Biggs Idea? I am so honored to have as a guest a person who just is so knowledgeable on international foreign affairs, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He is a retired Army colonel, combat veteran. He served as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump. Currently, he's the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, a new people's movement and media platform. He has an MA in comparative politics and a PhD in international relations from the University of Virginia. He's the author of 5 books as well. So he's a scholar, he's an author, he's a warrior, and I am so grateful to have you on today with me, Colonel Macgregor. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, sir, thank you for inviting me.
So the Congress is debating, and has been for several months now, this notion of continuing to fuel and fund the Ukrainian government, not just their military, but their government. And so my question for you is, why, and how much longer, and what do you see happening there?
Well, as a general proposition, we have not had, and certainly do not have right now, what I would call a coherent national strategy, whether it's military, economic, political, makes no difference. What we do is we tend to sanction, bribe, bully, or bomb people into submission. And the problem that we've got is that this proxy war that we worked very, very hard to start, goading the Russians into attacking eastern Ukraine when it became clear to them that we were transforming eastern Ukraine into a platform for attack against Russia. We're now faced with an insoluble situation. Our proxy war has failed. All the money we've spent has been squandered. The equipment, whatever reached the front, has been destroyed. Over 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead, probably that many wounded that are permanently out of action. And if they were to force whatever remaining manpower they have, they might get 200 to 220,000 more men into uniform, but even those would probably be very overaged. That is, people that are my age, over 50, or very, very young, even 12, 13, and 14-year-olds. So it's turned into a machinery for the annihilation of the Ukrainian nation and people. It needs to stop. And any sane person would recognize the disaster and try to find a way forward with terms that both sides could accept. They may not be perfect for either, but at least terms that both sides can accept. And that includes neutrality for Ukraine, which never needed to join NATO to begin with.
So when I look at it, we think of Ukraine, and there was a certain reputation of Ukraine, justifiably so, I think many would say, as being the most corrupt nation, or one of the top corrupt nations in the world prior to Russia's invasion. Then you have, since Vladimir Zelensky has been there, he has suspended elections multiple times, including last weekend. So he suspends the elections. He arrests people of faith. He arrests media personnel. And at the same time, there's no mission statement. If you remember, and you and I talked about this early on, there was no objective for the U.S. What did we see happening? And then it kept morphing and morphing, ultimately to regime change. And for many in the Biden administration, it still is regime change for Russia. So I guess my question for you is, what is our mission? And is Ukraine able to, how will they ever, I'll save that for later. Just what is our mission statement? How do we know that it's over?
Well, as you point out, there was never any attainable political military objective that made sense for the United States. We have no strategic interests in eastern Ukraine, other than, frankly, stability and peace to ensure that the enormous abundance of food that Ukraine creates, along with Russia, as well as fertilizer, reaches the people that need it on the planet. We had no interest that justified this proxy war to kill anyone. But what we have seen very clearly are two objectives. Objective number one has turned into harm Russia. Do whatever you can to harm and theoretically weaken Russia. Well, that's been an enormous failure. Russia is now probably the number one economy in Europe. Germany has fallen to 6th or 7th place. Germany and many of its neighbors are being deindustrialized, and Russia is booming. It's booming because it has an abundance of resources and minerals, but also because its machinery works. The machinery of government works. So we failed miserably. If our effort was to harm Russia, the only thing we've done is severely harm Europe and ourselves. The second objective, which doesn't come up for discussion very much, is how do we reward our constituents and our donors? You live in donor-occupied territory. You know that only too well. Donors literally own the Senate. What do the donors want? Well, the donors want to spend money on the first objective, but this also allows them to transfer vast quantities of capital to their friends, their constituents, their supporters, and then in turn back to their friends on the Hill. It's a money laundering exercise because if you look at $60 billion, probably only $25 billion ever reaches Ukraine. The rest of it is simply repurposed in Washington, D.C. through the Defense Department, the defense industries, and then back into the local and political arenas. So that has been a very successful story, at least insofar as a minority of people have benefited enormously. And we've managed to keep assembly lines rolling for equipment that, frankly, is anachronistic and antiquated and we no longer need.
So, okay, there's two questions that arise there that I think I'd like you to address. I actually heard one of my congressional colleagues say that this is an excellent opportunity for us to use up our outdated inventory to try to replace it with updated material. And yet we're also told that it's going to take literally years to actually replace the inventory that we've given away. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the military structure is anachronistic. We have, I think, on active duty at the moment, 44 four-star generals for a structure that is designed for global military hegemony. At the same time, we've run our economy into the ground. It's anyone's guess when this is going to catch up with us and cause a serious financial crisis and major economic downturn. You can turn to Nassim Taleb, the man who created the notion of black swans, who says Armageddon is just over the horizon. And they keep asking Nassim Taleb when it's coming, and he says, no one knows, but it's pretty close. There are a lot of other people who agree with him. So I think the unwillingness to look at the structure from the standpoint of what do Americans really need for their security versus this elite, this ruling class of people who want to have military hegemony is a huge problem. You know, during World War II, when we had 12.2 million men under arms, and think about that, 12.2 million, we only had 7 four-stars for most of the war. The promotions came at the end of the war as honorifics. So what are we doing with 44 four-stars when we have, in terms of actual combat forces, the smallest force that we've had in 50 years, a force that we can't even recruit for? So I think the answer to the question is that we need to retrench. Anyone with any common sense would step back and say, we can't afford what we're doing and we need to stop. There's no willingness to do so because it's too financially rewarding. that suggests that when things fall apart, it will stop.
You said that's an interesting point. And before before I get to the second point I wanted to address with you, let's get this here. So what you're alluding to, and you said it, anachronistic, et cetera, is systemically, we are locked into what I would call a suboptimal path. We've built up regimes, rules, institutions that keep us going down this path that Dwight D. Eisenhower, as president, warned us about, and yet we continue to propel ourselves down that way. And the question is, because in the path dependence theory, it's really difficult to make a short-term exit because there's short-term immediate pain, even though you move to a long-term, more optimal path. Is how do we make the change to a more modern approach to national defense?
Well, you must have a new national military strategy. That's vital and essential. And that means a military strategy that is focused for the first time since NSC 68 in the 1950s on American national interests. And our interests are very straightforward. We want to preserve access to the global commons to ensure that commerce continues to benefit and communications work. We no longer need, nor do we have to have 800 bases around the world. Technology has changed. When you look at headquarters, the headquarters overhead, for instance, we fail to understand that there's a reason that Fort Riley, Kansas is the distance it is from Fort Leavenworth. How did they decide to put Fort Riley in the middle of Kansas, some distance from Fort Leavenworth on the Missouri River? Well, it's very simple. It was a day's ride on a horse. Well, we're dealing with a military structure that's still focused on World War II distances, communications, command structures. They need to go away. We need to become focused on Western hemispheric defense. And obviously, any American today looks at the world and he says, I don't know about what's happening in China or Northeast Asia or Eastern Europe or the Middle East, but I know one thing. We have a very serious problem with millions of people pouring into our country because there is no security at the border. There is no defense of the nation. And that's what Americans are focused on. And I get calls all the time from all over the world. Well, don't Americans understand this about Ukraine? Or don't they understand this about China and Taiwan? And I say, no, they're not focused. They're focused on the border. But it seems that the border is not a high payoff option for donors and for constituents. And so the border doesn't seem to matter inside the Beltway.
You know, I love what you said when you said we need to reevaluate, reassess, and reform our national defense strategy to adjudicate what is the American national interest and then prosecute that. That means, I'm not saying prosecute war, I'm saying do all that you can economically, strategically, to ensure that the American national interest is met. I mean, I ask this question often. I will say, well, what's our national interest with Ukraine? What is it? What is it? And no one seems to be able to give me an answer.
The only interest we had in Ukraine from the beginning, and the most important interest, by the way, today in the Middle East, those interests are very much alike. It's called peace and stability. We have an interest in peace and stability. We are a commercial power. What made us great is economic strength and prosperity. Economic strength and prosperity depends on stability and order in the international system. To the extent that we can foster that, we should do so, which means we should work for ways to promote peace and stability, not cultivate conflict. Certainly in my lifetime, and definitely for the last 25, 30 years, I've seen the opposite. Every effort is made to cultivate conflict, to push people and bully people into doing things that we think are important, whether it's with our financial system or it's with our military power. Weaning a government off of this is not easy when everyone has grown up in that environment and sees the future through that lens instead of what you just described. We know what we need in this country. We, in addition to security and the rule of law and ending this terrible, terrible nightmare of illegal migration, we need a few things. We need a very developed and effective energy sector. We've done everything in our power to destroy it. We need an agricultural sector that is thriving. What do we do best? What have we as Americans done better than most? Produce food, which is the absolute essence of prosperity in any modern civilization. And what happened to our manufacturing? People say, well, we exported it. Well, we didn't have to export all of it. And high-tech manufacturing used to be our strong suit. I don't hear anybody talking about building that and investing in it. Instead, we are essentially flogging a dead horse, pushing conflict, pushing interventions that are not in our interest, that produce nothing but economic disaster for ourselves and our friends.
Yeah, and just with regard to that, the energy sector, when that's humming, all other sectors can come along and go forward. And an example of that is one of the things that made our agriculture industry so powerful and potent was not just that we grew great quantities of food, but we distributed those efficiently and timely. And so when you attack your own energy base, you also hinder distribution bases. And we've seen that with the supply chain issues that we've had. So it becomes a huge problem. I wanted to ask you also about this, and that is the media and how it shapes the outlook and tries to shape this and quite frankly, maintain the systemic status quo for the military industrial complex.
Well, the man that wrote the book on that subject and probably did better than almost anyone else is Noam Chomsky. And he wrote this book entitled Manufactured Consent. And he talked about the enormous effort underway in the media in the United States to push the Vietnam intervention and to support the war and how this came about. I think much of what he wrote in that book is still valid. People look at me strangely because they said, well, you're more of a nationalist and conservative. Yes, but I can recognize truth when it's presented, and Noam Chomsky told the truth. We face a similar situation today, only I would argue it's even worse, because the distance between government and the media has been closed to the point where it's almost impossible to tell the difference. The tune that is sung on any given day in the Senate or the White House seems to be sung routinely across the mainstream media. Now, it's not having the effect it once did because large numbers of Americans, particularly everybody under the age of 40, turns to alternative media. I mean, by the way, when people ask why aren't more people willing to serve in the armed forces, it's because everybody under the age of 40 has said why. It's been self-defeating to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. Anybody with a brain showed up and discovered we're not going to change this place. We can't possibly alter it. It's the same mentality at home. The media says one thing, but the truth is still out there, and Americans are looking for the truth. And they do get it, but not in the volume that they need to. And there are still too many of us over the age of 40 who continue to draw poison from the poison well. I don't see how this changes quickly, other than to end the overseas interventions and get people to focus on what's really critical to the United States here at home. And that's not easy.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not easy. I mean, just to give you an update and our listeners an update, the speaker was trying very hard not to bring that Ukraine supplemental to the floor. I fear that will, when we get back in session, I fear that his resolve may be weakened a little bit, and I fear that we're going to have that. But we're talking roughly $61 to $65 billion, somewhat as high as $69 billion. But it won't, Colonel, it won't even be limited to military supplies. Mm-hmm. It includes funding their government, their pension plan, seeds and agricultural products for farmers over there. What is that about? I mean, it sounds almost like a nation building exercise from 1980s leftist scholars that I read when I was in grad school.
Well, sir, I think we can say without too much hesitation that Ukraine has become the 51st state. We're pouring infinitely more resources into Ukraine than we pour into our own country in many, many key areas. You also have the private sector which has close ties to key people in Washington. And I immediately turned to BlackRock. BlackRock, along with others, are eagerly buying up farmland, beautiful pasture that is for sale by Mr. Zelensky in Kiev. And one wonders whether Mr. Zelensky, on the one hand, has the mission to kill as many of his own people as possible, or Ukrainians, since Mr. Zelensky really technically was a Russian speaker and not Ukrainian. But maybe he wants to kill as many of them as possible and then sell off the country to foreigners for profit. It looks that way. And as you point out, nothing is being done to stop it. The only man that can stop Ukraine from being dissolved into nothingness and sold off at auction is probably the president in Russia, Vladimir Putin. I don't think he wants to. I think he wants to sit behind the Dnieper River, and he wants an end to the war. But we won't allow that to happen. We have a different agenda.
It is so. Let's leave Ukraine behind for just a moment, and let's talk one quick second about what I view to be a funding two sides of a belligerent, and that would be Iran. So at the same time that the Biden administration is talking about and making probably perceived as hollow threats to Iran, this administration continues to try to negotiate to reinvigorate, renew the Iran nuclear deal. And in the meantime, this administration has returned $150+ billion to Iran that it was holding. And Iran has turned around and funded Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other more regional terrorist organizations. What do you see in the policy, the Iranian policy of the Biden administration, if you see any kind of coherence at all?
Well, I think we can say with some certainty that the administration has, on the one hand, as you point out, tried to bribe the Iranians to stay out of the conflict involving Israel. And it's an interesting approach, since I don't think the Iranians want, under any circumstances, a war in the region with anybody, least of all Israel and the United States. And on the other hand, we've made it very clear that we don't want to risk an all-out regional war, and we know that we would get that if we directly attacked Iran. And if we were to attack Iran and do serious damage, it would not just unbalance the region, it would probably create additional refugee flows, but the Iranians then would launch everything they own, presumably at us and Israel, and we couldn't stop most of those missiles. I don't think this government has any strategy. Everything is a last-minute fix. It's a series of Band-Aids and bandages, but the patient is still dying. You can't bandage up the terminal patient. It's sort of Iran policy, to me, is analogous to the heart patient who's lying on the table and needs a transplant, a fresh start, an entirely new approach. But instead of getting that, the heart patient gets a haircut and a shave. So it is contradictory, but I also think there's a failure to see the region as more than a collection of states, when in fact it's a much larger issue for us. Iran and Turkey are two poles in the region, the two great powers that historically have dominated the place. We've never really come to terms with it, handled it intelligently. So, we could spend hours talking about this, but it doesn't matter, because people that are donors have essentially shaped that policy on a routine basis to their satisfaction. And most people in the Senate and the House, frankly, have gone along with it. No one has sat down and decided what is it that we would really like to achieve in the region.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, those of us who are trying to find some coherence somewhere, we find ourselves dealing with a lot of what I would call neocons, warhawks, whatever you want to call them. It makes it very difficult. The last point before we run out of time is I wanted to talk about I think and I'm going to ask for your response to this. I think one of the reasons that this policy is so incoherent is that you've got a lot of quasi-academics in the Biden administration trying to set policy based on academic theories and models that don't work. I mean, the one theory that I would say always works is realism. Realism works. Why? Because people like Putin, like Zelensky, they're realists. But I think this administration is filled with what I would call neoliberal, multilateral institutionalists, that rely on multilateral institutions. And when those fail, because they invariably do, they're left with a vacuum of thought, of ideas on how to deal with a very, very dangerous world, which is why I think realism works as a theory. Even if you don't want to be a realist yourself, realism works because that's how North Korea views itself. That's how Iran views itself. It's how Israel. It's how virtually every other leader outside of a small number of Western European nations view itself from a security basis. Now, they may not view themselves that way economically or anywhere else, but from a security basis, they view themselves as realists. Well, our government's now reached a vacuum because their neoliberal institutionalism doesn't work.
Well, if you look at whether it's President Xi in China or Putin in Russia or Modi in India, I would argue even the people that we don't like, the mullahs that are running the show in Tehran, who incidentally are not very popular with the Iranian people, obviously, or Mr. Erdogan. All of these leaders have a sense of limitation. We don't. Right. We've had a series of administrations over many years with this utterly foolish notion that our capabilities are limitless. There's nothing we can't do. And this is what distinguished Eisenhower. He went through the Second World War, and he saw it from a very different vantage point than most Americans did. He saw how limited our resources were, how few men we could actually field. And he looked at what the continental powers could do, and he resolved that never again should we fight in such a war. So he was always trying to scale back things. He said, if NATO is still here in 10 years, and he made this comment in 1956, then we will have failed, because he saw as vital and essential some sort of reconciliation, maybe a bad word, but a more realistic appraisal of the Soviets and ourselves as being essential to peace and stability. Right now, our armed forces are in ruins. What are we going to do in Ukraine? What are we going to do in the Middle East? The Navy is in terrible condition. The ships are not fully manned. Many of the missiles they have are in short supply. We don't seem to have a realistic view of ourselves. And if you have an unrealistic view of yourself, you're at great danger in the international system, because everybody else has thought this one through. And no one else is interested in going to war but us. And I hear that all the time. People overseas are shocked. War? Have you lost your minds? And we try to demonize everyone everywhere who doesn't agree with us, when in reality, in most cases, those disagreements don't make a big difference to us.
Right. Thanks, Colonel Macgregor. Always I learned so much talking to you. Thank you for your insight. Thanks for taking time with us today. It's amazing how quickly time will run out on us, and it has run out on us. But I appreciate your insights. And how do people follow you on social media?
Well, I think going to the website for Our Country, Our Choice, ourcountryourchoice.com is a good place to go. And I think you can find all the newest things that we've been doing that essentially send this message that you've been talking about, and others, some of your peers have tried to reinforce this, although obviously you're a minority, but it is a more realistic approach to the world and a desire to focus on the enormous problems that beset us here at home. They have to be solved. If we don't deal with these issues at the border and the illegal immigration and the rise in criminality, the failure to enforce the law, the chaos that is ensuing across this country will consume us and destroy us far, far earlier than any foreign enemy ever will, assuming that anybody wants to.
Thank you. And you have basically reiterated Abraham Lincoln's great prophecy, which is that it won't be a foreign power that destroys us. We'll destroy ourselves internally if we're to be destroyed. Thanks, Colonel Macgregor. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please join me next time on What's the Big Idea? Thank you.